So today I'm going to be releasing two videos, and this is thanks to Spence Young on the Waves Audiophiles Facebook group, and he asked, how do you use a channel strip and how do you treat the DAW as if it were an analog configuration? And these two topics are kind of working hand in hand with each other, hence why I'm going to release them at the same time. The first video we're going to be concentrating on what is a channel strip and how do you use them, and the second video is going to be elaborating on those basic concepts and how to treat the DAW as if it were a full analog configuration. So before we get into what a channel strip is, I just wanted to say if you're enjoying these videos, please like and subscribe, and if you have any thoughts, please leave them in the comments. And last week I also released some free drum samples over at my site audioproductiontips.com, and if you go to the free stuff page you can find them there, and in the info card up there I'll include the video that goes along with those drum samples to show you how to use them. So let's dive into what a channel strip is. Now historically a channel strip refers to one input channel of a mixing console, and it's got its name because mixing consoles were often laid out in columns or strips, with the signal flowing vertically from top to bottom. These days, channel strips are incorporated into lots of rack gear too, and the term is often used to describe a device which includes many of the common types of audio processing all housed in one unit. Therefore, I like to think of a channel strip like a Swiss Army knife for audio processing. A channel strip will be able to amplify or attenuate sources, flip the phase, EQ, and sometimes compression or gating too. And channel strips are very important because they allow you the flexibility to do everything all inside one unit, and this was particularly useful in the days before DAWs, because when you had tape machines you needed some way to interface all of those channels coming from the tape machine and do some audio processing to them before they were summed together and recorded onto a smaller 2-track tape machine, which is where your final mix would end up and then go to a pressing factory to get the vinyls cut. Now obviously these days in a DAW you have the chance to use your computer software like you would a mixing console, so channel strips from that perspective are slightly less important than they used to be. Mixing consoles these days are a very expensive luxury, but that doesn't mean that the channel strip principle is not important inside your DAW. And whilst it's certainly the case that you can add lots and lots of bespoke processing inside insert slots of your DAW, that doesn't mean there's not a place for a trusty channel strip. And the reason is that there's a certain simplicity and restrictions imposed by a channel strip that can make sure that you're not over-processing a source. Let's take EQ for instance, and with many modern EQs you're able to add an almost infinite number of bands of EQ, and sometimes you end up making things worse because of that. And with a channel strip you're usually restricted to 4 to 6 bands of EQ, and that's usually enough for any sound source, and if you're trying to use more than that, maybe you need to rethink your approach a little bit. And the same can be said for your approach to other processing too. And if you can't get a source to sound good with a trusty channel strip, maybe you haven't recorded things as well as you could in the first place. That's not to say that I don't use other plugins, I do all the time, okay? But sometimes some of those restrictions can be a good thing. Okay, so now we're in Pro Tools and I've got a session open with absolutely no plugins on, and I'm just going to play you a little bit of the song. It's kind of a hard rock song, and you'll see that things are kind of balanced and gain stage, but no more.
I kill for the chance to do it again. I give up, I gave in. I kill for the chance to do it again, but it's over too soon. I give it up.
Okay, so now you've had a listen to the raw tracking, let's just load up a channel strip so you can see one, and I'm going to do this on this kick channel here. So I'm going to load up the CLA Mixhub, which is Waves' new SSL E-Series channel strip, and this is based on Chris Lord-Alge, the well-known mixer's own console, and it's also got a few functions to it that make it a little bit closer to how you might mix on a console, and I'm going to explain that in a bit. So what we can see here is that we've got many sections here, and rather than working top to bottom like a channel strip would, to make it make more sense on a computer screen, it actually goes from left to right. So we can see that we've got our input section here, which features the line trim here, some mic gain, high and low pass filters, a 4-band EQ here, and also compression and gating and expansion, and then it goes into a panning and fader section. So we can see the layout here is working from left to right, and I'll explain the functions of these different sections a little bit later on. But it's also worth noting that one of the things about this plugin that's quite unique is that you can actually load up an insert. So on a mixing console, you would typically have an insert point in case you wanted to load up some sort of outboard equipment on that channel. And this is something that's not often available on plugins. And if we just hit this plus button here, we can load any Waves plugin onto this particular channel. Now, if we wanted something, a very digital sounding EQ that was able to do a very surgical narrow bandwidth, we could load a Q10 here, and we can then tweak around that as you usually would, and hit this little button here, these two screen icons, to go back to the plugin, and we can see that we've got the Q10 loaded up here. So that's a nice little feature. But for me, the biggest thing that makes this particular channel strip a very good option is the fact that you can load many instances of this and see those instances and multiple instances at the same time. Usually if you had other channel strips or other plugins, when you're flicking around, you would only be able to see one instance at a time. So if I go ahead and I'm going to copy that to the snare here, and I'm going to copy it to the toms, the overheads, and the rooms. So they're the basic components of my drums, and I can see many of those instances at the same time. So what I need to do this is to go to what's called bucket view. And on any old console, you typically had modular features, meaning that if you wanted to do maintenance on the console, you could turn off a particular bank of faders and channel strips all at once, so that you could take certain channels out and fix them and then put them back in. And often these were in buckets of 8 channels at a time. So when we're in bucket view here, we can see 8 channels, okay? And we can assign, by hitting this assign button, other channels to each of these buckets. So I'm just going to, now I'm selected on bucket 1, and I'm going to just assign these drum components to that bucket. And now I'm going to just double click here and call it drums. Okay, so if I close this up, now we can see that I can see all of the input sections of these drum parts all at once. And I can actually go see the EQs and the dynamic sections and the output sections, okay? And I'm seeing them all together. And that's kind of more like how you would operate on a mixing console, is that I can reach for things very, very quickly, okay? And how I would get started with this is I would do some kind of gain staging, because one of the best things about a mixing console is you can drive the console harder to get a bit more analog color. And as long as you've got this analog button on here, it will kind of model that saturation and the extra harmonics that you get from a mixing console. And I can drive this line trim harder, and I can actually get some distortion out of it, and then I can just back the output down so that it seems roughly the same level. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to do that to the drums. I'm going to drive them harder to just get a bit more attitude out of them, and then back the output down back to roughly where it was to begin with. Okay, so hopefully what you could hear there is I'm driving it harder on the input and backing the output down. And whilst in most DAWs, if you're seeing kind of red light clip indicators come on, that's a bad thing. But it's actually just clipping the internal part of the console. So this would be like clipping the input stage and adding a little bit of extra growl, and it's not necessarily hard clipping and distorting in a very uncolourful and kind of detrimental way. It'll be clipping in a more soft clipping analog style, and by backing the output down I can make sure that I'm not getting the digital detrimental effects of the channels clipping. So if I look at the output here, as long as these outputs aren't clipping, I should be good to go. So you can see that the input might be clipping, but the output is got a healthy level of headroom, so that's good to go. And one other thing that I like to do often, and particularly on room mics and sometimes on vocals and stuff too, is actually rather than using the line gain, I'm going to use the mic gain, which gives you an extra 30 decibels or 40 decibels of boost. And this is just a great way to make something super gritty. Okay, so let's hear these drums with these channel strips turned off, and remember we haven't done any EQ or compression or gating on them yet. This is just by using the input drive. Okay, so we've got a little bit of volume bias here, so I'm just going ahead and just lowering it a little bit. So hopefully what you're noticing there is that kick drum's just a little bit more pokey on the front end and a little bit more punchy, and the rooms kind of come out and get a little bit grittier too. So let's go ahead and let's now do some EQ together, and the EQ and compression, doing that all, you know, as a unit rather than having to flick between all the different plugins, can be really, really useful to me. And in true kind of Chris Lord Algae style, I'm going to do some hefty boosts in the lows and the highs to kind of make these drums larger than life. Okay, so you could see there how quickly I can kind of get the EQs in shape across the whole drums, and I can kind of just focus on these particular instruments and channel sources together rather than having to load one up at a time. And I think that that's just really useful in this plugin, and kind of gets you a little bit closer to a kind of analog workflow. So let's just turn these on and off again. Okay, so they're a lot punchier now. Okay, so now I'm going to see if I can tighten up these kicks and snares by gating them a little bit. And we're going to be using the expander gate function, which are all of these green knobs down here. Okay, so I'm just going to solo the kicks to begin with. And how I'll usually start is with the range set to the maximum, which is 40 decibels. So when the gate is closed, it's going to turn the signal level down by 40 decibels. I'm going to leave the attack, the release, and the hold on the shortest possible settings, so that this will turn the sound into a very clicky type of sound. So this will be highly unnatural, but it will be able to get me to a point where I know that it's triggering correctly, and then I can kind of loosen the release and the hold so that it feels a bit more natural, and maybe back off the range to allow a little bit of that bleed back in. Okay, so I ended up trying a few of the different options here. The gate seemed to really like clamp down a little bit too much and felt a bit unnatural, and like it almost like clicked and popped as it cut off. The expander felt a little bit better, so that wouldn't kind of mute it quite so much in the way that it released. Okay, so I prefer that, and now I can kind of loosen this off. And the idea here is that I'm not making the kick drum sound unnatural. I'm just kind of reducing as much of that background noise as possible, but without being detrimental to the sound of the kick. Okay, so hopefully what you're seeing from the meters here is that we're getting between 10 to 14 dBs of gain reduction happening when that kind of kick has finished its sustain period. So we're getting a lot less cymbals and a bit less snare in there than we were before. And I'm kind of happy with that sort of level of reduction. I think that quite often people hit gates a little bit too hard and it ends up sounding a bit unnatural. So let's go ahead and let's do the snare. So that feels like it's triggering well, and now let's bring the release out. And now let's back the range back off so that I'm letting a bit more of that bleed through. So that's really helped to get rid of some of that kind of washing ride that goes on in the chorus there. So let's put the kick and snare back on together, and we're going to turn off the gating. Okay, so what you can hear there is that because there's less bleed, the kick and snare kind of come forward quite a bit and they kind of seem more direct and a bit more punchy. So to finish this off, I'm actually going to add a little bit of compression here. So what I'm aiming to do is to just get a little bit more smack out the drums and just a little bit of extra consistency. So let's start with the kick drum. Okay, great. So what I was doing there is I was using the inbuilt desk compressor. If you hit this type button here, it becomes a Blue Stripe 1176, which we'll probably use on the snare. This is something that the actual SSL E-Series desk doesn't do, but it's something that Chris Lord-Alge likes to do, is to use the Blue Stripe 1176s on a lot of sources, so it's kind of been added to this plugin. And how I'm making it work is I've got a fast attack time here, which is roughly 3 milliseconds. The slow attack time is about 30. And I'm just trying to just take a little bit of that kind of initial transient out, and I'm doing this in a way that's kind of got a wet and dry blend. So I'm at 22.4%, so basically it's only using 22% of the compressed signal, and the rest of it is being the dry signal. And what I was finding is when I was 100% wet, i.e. only compressed, I was losing too much of the bottom end. So by being at 22%, I got that bottom end, but I also got that extra consistency, and that was something that I was quite liking here. This wet and dry blend of the compressor is not on the original desk, so this is another good extra. So let's go ahead and start with the snare. And typically the SSL desk compressor is not quite so grabby and not quite so aggressive sounding. So by going to the 1176 Blue Stripe, I think I can get some extra harmonic distortion and grittiness out of this particular snare drum. Okay, so I've made that sound very, very aggressive, very grabby, and it's kind of bringing out all of the excitement out of the particular drum sound, and it's bringing out the roominess of the drums. This obviously wouldn't be great if you were leaving it like this, but because I have this wet and dry blend, I can actually kind of balance out that kind of more natural feel against that kind of super smashed sound. And let's put that back in with everything else. So now we've got the drums roughly in place, let's add more Mixhubs to other channels and kind of treat them like we've just done with the drums. But before we get to that, I wanted to quickly talk to you about how this CLA Mixhub works best. And I found that because you've got 8 banks of 8, that means that you've got a total of 64 channels that you can run through the Mixhub. And this kind of goes hand in hand with how people used to deal with things in the analog domain. And, you know, even the highest channel counts might have only like daisy chained 2 or 3 24-track tape machines together, and you were kind of limited. You couldn't have the couple of 100 or 300 channels that a lot of pop mixing sessions have these days. And usually that amount of channels is pretty hard to mix because you're constantly just trying to work your way through them and work out what you've got and trying to get in a position where it's actually more manageable. And what Crystal Algae does, and many other top mixers do, is they get their assistants to strip down those number of tracks and bounce things down to such an extent that that can fit onto, like, say 48 channels of a mixing console, or sometimes even less. And what this will do is it'll allow you to concentrate on the important things. So in this particular instance, I was able to take these 3 kick drum channels, okay, and sum them to 1 auxiliary, and I just put the CLA Mixhub on that. And just by doing that, I've saved a bunch of channels of drums, okay. And if you were to do that with all of the channels, I could significantly reduce the amount of channels that I needed to process. And the beauty of DAWs is if I did want to load up a plugin on the kick-in, I can do that. But the Mixhubs are really about how to shape things together rather than individual sources. Okay, so I'm going to go through and I'm going to add this to various other important buses or important channels. And now before I started this video, I thought that there was too many guitar channels to handle, so I've summed down the cleans, the rhythms, and the heavies to their own auxes too. But the rest of these guitars are on their own. So that's loaded the Mixhub onto all of these important channels. And let's go ahead and assign them. So we need to go back to bucket view. Now let's select 2, which will be my percussion and bass. And let's assign those. 3 will be guitars. 4 will be my lead vocals. And 5 will be backing vocals. Okay, so you see how quickly that kind of got added together, and what I'm going to do now is probably the process that I would usually do straight away, is load up all of these Mixhubs on, and then I'm going to kind of, as the track's playing, really like massage everything into place fairly quickly by flicking through the different buckets. Let's start with this percussion and bass.
I kill for the chance to do it again. I give up, I gave in. I kill for the chance to do it again. But it's over too soon. I give it up, I'll bear it to you. I give you hell to play. There'll be hell to play. There'll be hell, I'll wait.
Okay, and I think that bass needs a little bit of compression too.
I kill for the chance to do it again. I give up, I gave in. I kill for the chance to do it again. But it's over too soon. I give it up, I'll do it to you. I give you hell to pay. But we hell to pay.
And I think that's going to sound pretty good when I get the guitars kind of souped up as well. Let's go ahead and get some of this tambourine in. So the guitars, because they're quite distorted, don't really need any compression there, but just making them, the rhythms and the heavy, sound a little bit different to each other. So I've given the heavy some more of the airy super top and taken some mids out of them, low mids, whereas I'm kind of making the rhythm guitars more mid-heavy so that they kind of are the driving focus, especially on small speakers. Okay, so I'm driving these subby ones hard, but what I'm going to try and do is give them some extra stereo width, so that when the chorus hits, you can see that they're only in certain places of the song, you know, when the song's meant to be at its biggest. So having them super wide might be really good, and I can use this extra stereo width here available on the output section of the channel strip. And this is something, again, that's not on the real SSL, but it's something that's incredibly useful. And now let's get it on the lead vocal. And in this particular instance, I think that I'm going to try and drive the mic gain on this lead vocal to make it more distorted and heavier.
So expect a bruise. So expect a bruise. Oh, wait, so expect a bruise. Another face for a sinful lie. But it's all that too soon. I give it all, we'll bear it to you. But it's I'll give you all to pay. That we held to pay. That we held our ways. I'll give you all to pay. That we held to pay. That we held our ways. So it is. I'll give you all to pay. That we held to pay. That we held our ways. So it is. I'll give you all to pay. That we held to pay. That we held our ways. So it is. I'll give you all to pay. That we Step outside, I guess I'll blow your mind. But it's over too soon. Another chance. But it's over too soon. But it's over too soon. Another chance to but it's over too soon. But it's over too soon. But it's over too soon. Another chance. But it's over too soon. Another chance to chew what you miss. I'll give you all. But it's over too soon. Another chance to chew what you miss. I'll give you all to pay. That we held to pay. That we held.
So now I've got everything into place, I can kind of see that my gain stagering's gone up a few dB, so I'm just going to kind of pull everything back just a little.
But it's over too soon. Another chance to chew what you miss. I'll give you all to pay. That we held to pay. That we held our ways. So expect that blues. So expect that blues.
Okay, so now I've kind of regained stage things and kind of set things back at a rough level. You could see how quickly I was moving about the whole session without actually having to go to individual channels and working on things there. Let's turn off all of these Mixhubs and see where we started and where we're at now.
But it's over too soon. Another chance to chew at your noose. I'll give you all to pay. That we held to pay. That we held our weight, so expect a bruise.
So I feel like the drums, the bass and the vocals sit well, but I kind of want some of these guitars to just have a little bit more edginess about them, so just going to go and put a bit more aggression in the upper mid-range.
But it's over too soon. Another chance to chew at your noose. I'll give you all to pay. That we held to pay. That we held our weight, so expect a bruise. So expect a bruise. But it's over too soon. Another chance to chew at your noose. I'll give you all to pay. That we held to pay. That we held our weight, so expect a bruise. But it's over too soon. Another chance to chew at your noose. I'll give you all to pay. That we held to pay. That we held our weight, so expect a bruise.
Okay, so there you have it. I've gone through and I've kind of processed everything with the CLA Mixhub channel strips, and I've shown how quickly you can move around with this thing and how it sounds. In the next video, we're going to take this a stage further and think about the other important aspects of a fully analog configuration.